The ocean thunders against rotting shores, lightning splits a blackened sky, and from the corpse of something divine, something impossible crawls forth, screaming. Tonight, we descend into one of gaming's darkest and most heartbreaking tales, the story of the Orphan of Kos, a being born into death, cursed by sorrow, and doomed to eternal rage. This is a story about the price of knowledge, the horror of violation, and what happens when gods themselves cry out for revenge. Now get comfortable. Pull your blankets close. Let the world outside fade away. Because the story of the Orphan of Kos will take us through fishing villages cursed by divine wrath, through the minds of scholars who sought forbidden knowledge, through nightmares that trap hunters for eternity, and finally to a beach where an impossible child battles against those who would end its eternal suffering. This is the complete story of the Orphan of Kos. Long before we can understand the orphan, we must first understand the place where it dwells. The hunter's nightmare is not simply a bad dream, it is a cosmic punishment, a plane of existence constructed from blood and guilt, where those who drank too deeply of violence find themselves trapped forever. Imagine dying, only to wake up in a twisted version of the world you knew. The streets are familiar but wrong. The buildings lean at impossible angles. The sky is choked with blood-red clouds that never part, and everywhere, always, there is hunting. Beasts prowl endlessly. Blood-drunk hunters stalk the shadows, their minds lost to an eternal frenzy. The hunt never ends because it cannot end. This is the curse. The hunter's nightmare exists in layers, each one revealing more of the terrible secrets that birthed it. The first layer resembles Yharnam itself, the Gothic city where the hunt began, but everything is corrupted. The streets run with rivers of blood. Corpses hang from every surface. The beasts are larger, more terrible, twisted by the nightmare into forms that defy nature. This nightmare wasn't always here. It was created, called into being by an act so terrible, so fundamentally wrong, that reality itself rebelled and constructed this eternal prison for those responsible. To understand what could create such a place, we need to go back to a time before the curse, before the nightmare, to a small fishing hamlet where something impossible washed ashore. But the nightmare has more to show us first. As hunters venture deeper through this blood-soaked realm, fighting past corrupted beasts and maddened hunters, they discover something unexpected. Beyond the twisted streets of Nightmare Yharnam, beyond the blood-soaked cathedral and the burning beast, there lies a structure that shouldn't exist in this place, the research hall. This towering building was once part of the Healing Church's earliest attempts to commune with the divine, to transform humanity into something greater. The patients here were volunteers, believers who thought they were serving a higher purpose. The church promised them transcendence, eyes on the inside, the ability to perceive the cosmos as the great ones did. What they received instead was torture disguised as treatment. Their heads were opened, their brains exposed to strange fluids harvested from beings beyond human comprehension. Some grew eyes where eyes should never be. Others lost their human shape entirely, their bodies elongating, their limbs multiplying until they barely resembled the people they once were. The patients of the research hall still wander its corridors in the nightmare. They're docile now, harmless, calling out for a woman named Maria who once showed them kindness. They don't understand that Maria is gone, that whatever mercy she offered them couldn't undo what the church had done. They wait for her still, these broken experiments, hoping she'll return to ease their suffering. At the top of the research hall stands the Astral Clocktower, and it is here that the nightmare reveals its true purpose. The clock tower exists as a gateway, a threshold between one nightmare and another. And guarding this threshold, sitting motionless in a chair as though she's been waiting for centuries, is Lady Maria herself. Maria is different from the blood-drunk hunters who inhabit the earlier layers of the nightmare. Her mind is intact. Her purpose is clear. She guards the clock tower not because she's compelled to hunt, but because she knows what lies beyond it. She knows the secret that created this nightmare, the sin that doomed all hunters to this eternal torment. And she's appointed herself the final barrier, the last defense against anyone who would uncover that terrible truth. When hunters approach Maria, she doesn't attack immediately. She sits perfectly still, a corpse in a chair, until someone reaches out to touch her. Only then does she rise, her eyes opening to reveal depths of sorrow and determination. Her words are gentle, almost apologetic, but their meaning is absolute. She will not let you pass. The secret must remain hidden. The nightmare must be protected. Fighting Maria is like dancing with death itself. She moves with impossible grace, her blade singing through the air in elegant arcs. Blood magic, which she once despised, now flows freely from her attacks. In life, Maria rejected the blood techniques of her Canehurst heritage, favouring skill and precision over supernatural power. But in death, in this nightmare, she has embraced everything she once refused. The blood becomes fire, the fire becomes rage, and through it all, Maria fights not with hatred, but with the desperate resolve of someone protecting something she loves. When Maria falls, when hunters finally break through her defense, something remarkable happens. The clock tower activates, ancient mechanisms grind to life. The face of the clock begins to turn, but it's not showing time. It's showing something else entirely, something impossible to describe. Reality bends, space folds, and through the opened passage in the clock tower's heart, hunters can finally access the deepest layer of the nightmare. The Fishing Hamlet exists outside normal geography. It doesn't appear on any map of the waking world, cannot be found by conventional means. Some scholars believe it was a real place once, a small coastal settlement where simple people lived simple lives. Others think it was always part dream, a location that existed in the liminal space between the material world and the cosmic planes where great ones dwell. What we know for certain is this: the Fishing Hamlet was home to people who lived in harmony with the ocean. They were fisher folk, making their living from the sea, worshipping the depths as the source of all sustenance. Their lives were hard but peaceful, their faith simple but genuine. They asked little from the world and received less. The architecture of the hamlet reflects this modest existence. Small huts cluster together along winding paths. Boats rest against every available surface, some upright, some capsized, all worn smooth by years of use. Fishing nets hang everywhere, draped across rooftops and stretched between buildings. The smell of salt and fish must have permeated everything. But something changed the people of this hamlet. Something transformed them from ordinary fisher folk into something else entirely. Their bodies began to change. Scales emerged from their skin. Their eyes grew larger, more bulbous, able to see in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean. Their hands and feet became webbed. Their mouths widened, filling with rows of needle-sharp teeth. These transformations weren't curses. The villagers didn't resist them. In their prayer and chants, in the way they moved and gathered, you can see something remarkable. They welcomed these changes. They saw them as blessings, gifts from the ocean itself, signs that they had been chosen for something greater than their simple lives. And they were right. They had been chosen, but not by the ocean. The source of their transformation lay on the beach below the hamlet, stretched across the sand like some impossible amalgamation of whale and woman and nightmare. Kos, or as some say, Cosm. A great one, a being of cosmic power and alien intelligence, had washed ashore. And unlike most encounters between great ones and humanity, which end in madness and death, the people of the fishing hamlet embraced Kos as their deity. The corpse of Kos dominates the beach. Even in death, the Great One is massive, easily the size of a small ship. The skin is pale, almost luminescent, covered in scales that shimmer with colours that seem to shift depending on how you look at them. The face, if it can be called a face, is disturbingly human in some aspects. There's a suggestion of features, of eyes and mouth, but arranged in ways that make human minds rebel at the sight. From Kos's body, the villagers harvested parasites. These weren't ordinary parasites, not simple organisms living off a host. These were phantasms, creatures that existed partially in the material world and partially in realms beyond human perception. The parasites looked like small, translucent masses, almost like jellyfish without the trailing tentacles pulsing with their own inner light. The villagers used these parasites for everything. They ate them, gaining sustenance that seemed to transcend normal nutrition. They burned them as fuel, creating flames that cast strange shadows and gave off no smoke. They even implanted them into their own bodies, allowing the parasites to reshape them from within, granting them the transformations that let them breathe water as easily as air, see in absolute darkness, withstand pressures that would crush ordinary human bodies. In their simple faith, the villagers believed Kos had come to them as a blessing. They tended to the corpse with reverence, treating it as a shrine, a holy site where the boundary between their world and the realm of the gods grew thin. They didn't understand that Kos was pregnant, that within the dead Great One's body, something impossible was gestating. Or perhaps they did understand, and that knowledge was what made them worship even more fervently. The villagers developed rituals around Kos's corpse. They would gather at the shore during certain times, perhaps when the moon was full or when the tides reached particular heights. They would chant prayers in their changed voices, sounds that were half human and half something else, echoing across the water. They would place offerings around the body, fish and shells and items precious to them, hoping to honour the being that had given them so much. One figure in particular stands out in the nightmare's recreation of the hamlet, the priest. He wanders the paths near the entrance to the hamlet, tall and hunched, his transformation more complete than most of his fellows. He carries no weapon, shows no aggression toward intruders. Instead, he chants, constantly, endlessly. He speaks prayers and curses, his words running together in a litany of grief and rage. Byrgenwerth, Byrgenwerth, he intones. Blasphemous murderers, blood-crazed fiends, atonement for the wretches by the wrath of Mother Kos. Curse the fiends, their children too, and their children's children forevermore. Each wretched birth will plunge each child into a lifetime of misery. These words tell us everything. They tell us what happened to the fishing hamlet. They tell us why the nightmare exists, and they tell us that the people of this peaceful village, these simple fisher folk blessed by a dead god, were betrayed in the most terrible way imaginable. The hamlet in the nightmare is frozen at the moment of its destruction. Boats lie overturned and broken, huts stand empty or collapsed, bodies wrapped in cloth fill some of the vessels, funeral preparations never completed. The villagers who remain are hostile now, attacking intruders with the desperate fury of people who've been hurt beyond measure and will never trust outsiders again. As you move through the hamlet, you find evidence of the atrocity everywhere. Oil barrels that the villagers used for their lamps, made from the parasites they harvested. Crude weapons fashioned from fishing implements, taken up in desperate defense, and in the shadows, in the corners of buildings and the depths of caves, the survivors. Not many, perhaps only a handful, but enough to remember, enough to pray for vengeance. The path through the hamlet leads inevitably downward, toward the shore, toward the corpse of Kos, and as you descend you can hear it, a sound that doesn't belong in this place, that shouldn't be possible. The sound of crying, the sobbing of something that has lost everything before it even had a chance to live. To understand the orphan, we must first understand the mother. Kos, or Kosm as some scholarly texts render the name, was a great one. But what does that truly mean? Great ones are beings that exist beyond the normal constraints of reality. They perceive time differently than humans, if they perceive it at all. They experience dimensions that human minds cannot conceive. To them, the physical universe is just one layer of a much larger existence, and they move between these layers as easily as humans walk between rooms. But for all their cosmic power, all their transcendent existence, the Great Ones suffer from one terrible, inexplicable tragedy. They cannot have children, not truly, not in the way that life should naturally propagate. Every Great One that attempts to reproduce finds the same result: stillbirth. The child forms, gestates, perhaps even grows to the point where birth should occur. But something always goes wrong. The infant is born dead, or it lives for moments before, fading, or it exists in some terrible state between life and death, neither fully alive nor fully deceased. The description we find repeated throughout the world of Bloodborne is simple and heartbreaking. Every Great One loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate. This is what drove the Great Ones to interact with humanity. Not malice, not some cosmic plan to destroy or transform the human race, simply yearning, the desperate, aching desire to have what cannot be had, to overcome the one curse that even beings of godlike power cannot defeat. Kos was one of these yearning gods. Her domain was the ocean, those vast depths where sunlight cannot reach, where pressure crushes and cold preserves. Sailors in the world of Bloodborne spoke of her in whispers, attributing strange phenomena at sea to her presence. Unusual tides that seemed to flow against all natural laws, areas of ocean that glowed with bioluminescence that formed shapes almost like writing, fish that swam in formations that suggested intelligence and purpose. Some evidence suggests that Kos was more involved with the surface world than most Great Ones. The parasites that filled her body and later infected the villagers appeared to be a form of communion, a way for Kos to share aspects of herself with mortals. The transformations the villagers underwent weren't random mutations. They were systematic, purposeful, designed to let humans survive in aquatic environments, to let them see the world more as Kos saw it. Perhaps Kos was trying to create surrogates in the most literal sense, not just substitute children, but beings that could serve as vessels for her offspring. The villagers' bodies, transformed by the parasites, might have been perfect incubators for something half human and half Great One. Or perhaps Kos simply wanted children in any form, and if she couldn't have her own, she would adopt these strange fisher folk who worshipped her with such simple faith. We don't know how Kos died. The evidence is contradictory. Some suggest she was already dead when she washed ashore, killed by something in the ocean depths that even great ones must fear. Others believe the villagers killed her, perhaps accidentally through their harvesting of the parasites, perhaps intentionally as some bizarre form of worship. A few scholars even propose that Kos committed suicide, that the Great One chose death as the only escape from the curse of eternal childlessness. What we do know is that Kos was pregnant when she died. Somehow, impossibly, a Great One who should not have been able to conceive had done so. Within her massive body, connected by what appeared to be an umbilical cord but which was actually something far stranger, an infant was developing. This child was different from the stillborn offspring that plagued every other Great One. This child was alive, growing, perhaps even aware. The villagers knew. How could they not? They tended to Kos's corpse daily, harvested the parasites that grew within it, observed every change in the body of their deity. They must have seen signs of the pregnancy. Perhaps they felt movement within the corpse. Perhaps the parasite's behavior changed, becoming more active or more protective. Perhaps they simply knew through faith, through that inexplicable certainty that sometimes comes to true believers. They called the unborn child the poor wizened child. This phrase appears repeatedly in their prayers and lamentations. Wizened suggests something aged, something old and worn, but the child was unborn, never given a chance to age. Perhaps wizened referred to the child's appearance, to the way it looked in their visions or in brief glimpses when they examined Kos. Or perhaps it referred to something deeper, to a sense that this child had endured suffering beyond its years, had experienced loss and pain that no infant should know. The villagers protected the corpse of Kos and the child within it. They built their lives around this, guardianship making it the center of their community and their faith. Kos had given them so much, the parasites that transformed them, the connection to something greater than their simple lives, a purpose beyond mere survival. In return, they would protect what Kos could not protect herself. They would guard the child that had somehow, impossibly, survived within the body of a dead god. And then the scholars came. Byrgenwerth was not originally a place of horror. It began as a seat of learning, a college where scholars gathered to study the ancient civilizations that had come before. These scholars were driven by pure intellectual curiosity. They wanted to understand. They wanted to know. They were not evil men, at least not at the beginning. The leader of Byrgenwerth was Provost Willem, an elderly man of profound intelligence and equally profound arrogance. Willem believed that humans were limited by their perceptions, that we see only a tiny fraction of reality, because our minds are designed to process only what's necessary for survival. To truly understand the universe, Willem theorized, humans needed to evolve beyond their current state. They needed to line their brains with eyes, to develop new organs of perception that could see what ordinary senses could not. We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood, Willem taught. Fear the old blood. It was both a warning and an aspiration. Blood, particularly the blood of ancient beings, held transformative properties, but transformation without understanding was disaster. One must first gain eyes to see, to truly perceive what the blood could do, before attempting to use it. Willem's search for this understanding led him to the Thumerian labyrinths beneath Yharnam, ancient catacombs where a civilization far older than modern humanity had once thrived. In those depths, Byrgenwerth scholars encountered beings that should not exist. Kin, they called them, creatures that seemed to be in the process of transforming into great ones, or perhaps were failed attempts at creating such beings. But the greatest discovery in the labyrinths was alive. Ebritas, daughter of the cosmos, a true great one, left behind when others of her kind had departed to whatever realm they originated from. Ebritas was docile, even helpful, allowing the scholars to study her, to extract samples of her blood, to learn her secrets. Yet even with a living great one to study, Willem could not find what he sought most desperately: the umbilical cord, the cord of the eye as the scholarly texts called it. This wasn't a literal umbilical cord as humans have. It was something else, an organ or structure unique to infant great ones, a connection to cosmic truth itself. Willem believed that if he could obtain one of these cords, if he could study it, understand it, perhaps even consume it, he would gain the eyes he sought. He would transcend human limitations and perceive reality as the great ones did. This is what brought Byrgenwerth to the fishing hamlet. Someone, somehow, had learned of Kos. Perhaps a villager had left the hamlet before the transformation was complete, spreading stories of the dead god on the beach. Perhaps the parasites had spread beyond the hamlet, and scholars studying them traced their origin. Perhaps Willem himself, in his communion with Ebritas, learned of Kos's existence. However they discovered it, the scholars recognized the opportunity immediately. A dead great one that had been pregnant. If the child had survived, even partially, they could extract its cord. They could have what Willem had been seeking for years. Willem didn't go himself. He was too old, too frail, too valuable to risk on what might be a dangerous expedition. Instead, he sent his most trusted agents. Gehrman, a skilled hunter and craftsman who had helped defend Byrgenwerth from the beast that plagued the region. Lady Maria, a noble from distant Canehurst who had become one of Gehrman's finest students. And others, hunters and scholars both, formed an expedition to the distant hamlet. The expedition was not secret. They didn't sneak into the hamlet under cover of darkness. They arrived openly, probably expecting the villagers to cooperate. After all, what could simple fisherfolk do against trained hunters? What reason would they have to resist scholars who simply wanted to study and learn? The villagers resisted anyway. When the Byrgenwerth expedition tried to examine Kos's corpse, tried to access the child within, the fisherfolk fought back with everything they had. They were not warriors. Their weapons were fishing implements, harpoons and hooks and nets. Their transformations had made them stronger and more resilient, but not enough to match trained hunters who had faced and killed beasts far more dangerous than transformed humans. The massacre that followed was systematic and terrible. The hunters didn't just kill those who actively fought them, they killed everyone. Men, women, perhaps even children, though the sources are unclear on this point. The hamlet was small, isolated. Everyone who lived there was witness to the scholars' presence, and witnesses could spread word of what happened here. But the killing wasn't the worst of it. The scholars wanted to understand the transformations the villagers had undergone. They wanted to know how the parasites worked, how they changed human bodies, how they created connections to the cosmic realm. So they experimented. The description of the accursed brew, an item found in the hamlet, tells us what the scholars did. Skulls blessed by the witch of the hamlet used to throw and explode a skull. The skull burst open to spew vicious grudge. Long ago, the residents of the Fishing Hamlet were in contact with arcane forces, but they were deceived by false promises and murdered. But more damning is another description from cut content. The insides of their heads were forcibly searched for eyes. The scholars cracked open the villagers' skulls while they were still alive. They dug through brain matter, looking for the eyes that lined the brain as they lined Willem's own head. They wanted to see if the parasites had granted the villagers the inner eyes that Byrgenwerth sought. They performed these vivisections without anesthetic, without mercy, possibly without even the pretense of medical procedure. They were simply looking, searching, trying to understand at any cost. Maria witnessed all of this. Lady Maria, who had become a hunter to protect people, who had rejected the blood magic of her Canehurst heritage because she found such techniques distasteful, was present for the slaughter and the experimentation. We don't know if she participated directly, but even if she only stood guard while others did the cutting, she was complicit. She knew what was happening. She did nothing to stop it. Gehrman was there too, the first hunter, the man who would later be called the best of his generation. His hands, so skilled at crafting beautiful weapons, may have been the same hands that held screaming villagers still while scholars peered into their open skulls. And finally, the expedition reached Kos. They stood before the corpse of the Great One, surrounded by the bodies of those who had worshipped it. And they did what they had come to do. They cut into Kos, they found the child within, and they took what they wanted. The exact details are lost. Some scholars believe the orphan was already dead at this point, killed when Kos died, and Byrgenwerth simply extracted the cord from its body. Others believe the orphan was alive, and the scholars killed it to harvest the cord. The words of the villagers suggest the latter. Mother is dead, her baby taken. Taken, not found. Taken implies something alive, something stolen. What we know for certain is that Byrgenwerth left the Fishing Hamlet with a cord of the eye, the umbilical cord of a great one. Willem would study it, perhaps consume it, and from it gain the insight he sought. The Healing Church, which would later split from Byrgenwerth, would use the knowledge gained from this atrocity to further their own research into blood healing and transformation. Everything that followed in Yharnam, all the power and knowledge that led to the founding of the Healing Church, can be traced back to this moment on a beach where scholars murdered an entire village for the sake of understanding. Lady Maria left the hamlet last. While the others gathered their samples and prepared to return to Byrgenwerth, Maria lingered. She found a well in the hamlet, one of the community gathering places where villagers would have drawn water and shared news and simply lived their lives. And into this well Maria threw her rakuyo, the weapon she had favoured above all others because it relied on skill rather than blood. The description of the rakuyo tells us Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower gave up on her beloved rakuyo when she could no longer stomach it. She could no longer stomach fighting, could no longer stomach being a hunter, could no longer stomach what she had done and what she had allowed to happen. Maria would never hunt again. she would eventually take her own life, though whether through poison, blade, or simply losing the will to continue living is unclear. And when she died, her spirit was pulled into the hunter's nightmare, where she would serve as the guardian of the secret, the keeper of the truth about what Byrgenwerth had done. But the story of the Fishing Hamlet didn't end with Maria's departure. The dead do not forget. The cosmos remembers, and Kos, even in death, was still a god, still. The Orphan of Kos exists in multiple states simultaneously, which is fitting for the offspring of a being that transcended normal reality. In the material world, in that long ago moment when Byrgenwerth came to the hamlet, the orphan was killed, or died, or was taken before it could be born. The cord was extracted. The body, if there was a body, was either destroyed or taken for study. But great ones don't die the way mortals die. Death for them is transformation, a shedding of physical form while consciousness continues in other planes. The orphan's consciousness, its essence, survived, and in the hunter's nightmare, in that cosmic prison constructed from guilt and rage, the orphan was born properly. When hunters finally make their way through the nightmare, past the blood-drunk hunters and twisted beasts, through the research hall where the church's sins are on display, past Lady Maria's desperate defense of the secret, they emerge in the nightmare version of the Fishing Hamlet, and at the shore, where Kos's corpse stretches across the sand like a beached ship, something moves. From within the body of Kos, from between the ribs of the dead Great One, something crawls forth. At first, it might be mistaken for just another part of the corpse, more intestines or organs spilling out. But then it stands, it straightens, and hunters realize with horror that they're looking at something alive, something aware, something that has been waiting for them. The Orphan of Kos is both beautiful and terrible. Its body is humanoid in the basic sense. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head. But everything is wrong, stretched and distorted. The skin is pale, almost translucent, showing organs and structures beneath that shift and pulse. The head is elongated, the face frozen in a permanent rictus, mouth open in a scream that never stops. The eyes, if they can be called eyes, are too large, reflecting too much light, seeing too much. From its back hangs a membrane, thin as paper but somehow impossibly strong, draping across its shoulders like a shredded cape. This membrane is what remains of the placenta, still connected to the orphan's body, never properly separated because the birth never properly happened. The orphan wields this placenta membrane like a weapon, swinging it with tremendous force, using it as a flail or club or whip depending on the needs of the moment. The most striking thing about the orphan's appearance is how young it looks. This is an infant great one, something that should have been cradled and protected and nurtured. Instead, it stands on a nightmare beach, next to the corpse of its mother, and every line of its body communicates rage and grief in equal measure. When hunters first encounter the orphan, it doesn't attack immediately. This detail is important. The orphan stands at the water's edge, its back to approaching hunters, and it looks up at the sky, up at the nightmare moon that hangs overhead, up at something that only it can see, and it cries. The sound is heartbreaking. It's not the roar of a monster or the shriek of something mindless. It's sobbing, deep racking sobs that shake the orphan's entire frame. The sound is distorted, layered with harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. But underneath the alien quality, the grief is unmistakable. This is the moment the orphan mourns everything it lost. the life it never got to live, the mother it will never know except as a corpse, the piece of the grave that was denied to it, keeping its consciousness trapped in this nightmare state forever. For just these few seconds before the fight begins, the orphan is not a monster. It's just a child, alone and suffering. Then the hunter approaches and something changes in the orphan. The sobbing stops. The shoulders straighten. The orphan turns, and in its two large eyes hunters see recognition. It knows what stands before it. Another hunter. Another scholar. Another murderer come to finish what Byrgenwerth started. And the grief transforms instantly into rage. The shrieking begins. That sound, that terrible endless scream becomes the orphan's voice. It screams when it attacks. It screams when it's hurt. It screams between every action, as though the scream is the only language it knows, the only way it can express the magnitude of what was done to it and its mother. The placenta in the orphan's hands is not a placeholder weapon. Look closely at it, and you can see something horrifying. There's metal embedded in the organic matter. A hook. A fishing hook. The same kind the villagers would have used, possibly the very one that caught Kos or was embedded in the great one when the scholars cut her open. The orphan wields the tool that killed its mother, uses it to strike down those who come to its nightmare shore. The poetry of this is brutal and perfect. In its first form, the orphan fights with a kind of wild fury. It swings the placenta in wide arcs, using the reach and flexibility to keep hunters at a distance. It can throw pieces of the placenta that explode with a strange energy, creating zones of dangerous power on the beach. It leaps and dodges with surprising agility for something so large, its movements more acrobatic than any beast. But this is just the beginning. When the orphan is injured enough, when it's been hurt past some critical threshold, something changes. The orphan bites into its placenta weapon, tears at it with its teeth, and the transformation begins. The membrane on its back spreads, growing larger, splitting into wing-like appendages that catch the air. The placenta itself changes, hardening, lengthening, transforming from a flail into something more like a scythe or glaive. The orphan's movements become faster, more desperate, more violent. The screaming intensifies. In this second form, the orphan doesn't just fight on the beach, it takes to the air, launching itself skyward in great leaping bounds, hovering for impossible, moments before crashing back down. When it lands, energy radiates from the impact point, waves of force that damage everything in their path. It can summon lightning from the corpse of Kos, calling upon its mother's remaining power to strike down hunters with electricity that arcs across the water and sand. The fight becomes chaos. The orphan is everywhere and nowhere, moving too fast to track consistently, striking from angles that should be impossible. It throws blood, its own or something worse, which explodes on impact. It creates zones of crackling energy that damage and stun. It never stops moving, never stops screaming, never stops attacking with the fury of something that has suffered beyond bearing, and will make that suffering known to everyone it encounters. Fighting the orphan requires perfect execution. There's no room for error, no opportunity to retreat and recover. Every move must be precisely timed, every dodge exactly placed. One mistake, one moment of hesitation or poor judgment, and the orphan's attacks will destroy hunters in seconds. This is by design. This is intentional. The orphan is testing everyone who comes to this beach, asking a simple question. Are you willing to suffer as I have suffered? Are you willing to endure what I endure? When the orphan is finally defeated, when its physical form is broken and destroyed, something remarkable happens. The body doesn't fade or dissolve like most defeated nightmares. Instead, it falls and lies still, and above the corpse of Kos, something becomes visible that wasn't there before. A black phantom, a shadow, the true form of the orphan, the consciousness that had manifested as the physical being hunters just fought. This phantom hovers over Kos, moving in agitation, clearly distressed by what has just occurred. It has been freed from its physical prison but doesn't know what to do with that freedom. It's trapped still, chained to this nightmare shore, unable to rest, unable to leave, unable to do anything except exist in this state of between. Hunters must strike down this phantom too. It's not a fight exactly. The phantom doesn't attack, can't attack, but it must be dismissed, released, allowed to finally depart. When the phantom is destroyed, when that final connection is severed, something beautiful and sad occurs. The nightmare begins to change. The storm that has raged over the beach since the beginning starts to calm. The lightning ceases, the wind drops, and for the first time in eternities there is peace on this cursed shore. The hunter's nightmare exists because of what happened at the Fishing Hamlet. Understanding this connection is crucial to grasping the full scope of Kos's revenge and the price paid by those who committed the atrocity. When the villagers of the Fishing Hamlet died, they died in agony. They died betrayed by those they had tried to help, or at least had not resisted. They died watching their homes burn and their deity desecrated. They died knowing that the child they had protected was being taken, harvested like the parasites they had freely given. The intensity of their collective suffering created something in the cosmic realm, a resonance of rage and betrayal that echoed beyond their deaths. But the villagers alone could not have created the hunter's nightmare. They were mortals, however transformed. Their power, even in death, would not have been sufficient to construct an entire plane of existence dedicated to eternal punishment. What gave their curse its terrible power was Kos herself. Kos was dead, but death means something different for great ones. Their consciousness doesn't simply cease when their physical form expires. It transcends, moves to other layers of reality, continues existing in states that mortal minds cannot comprehend. When Kos died, when the scholars killed her child and desecrated her body, her consciousness remained aware and angry. Great ones are not typically emotional beings, at least not in ways humans would recognize. They operate on scales of time and space that make individual events seem meaningless. The death of a single human would be to them as the death of a single bacterium is to us, so far beneath notice as to be invisible. But maternal instinct transcends species, transcends even the boundaries of normal reality. Kos loved her child, and someone had killed it. The curse Kos laid upon those responsible is mentioned explicitly by the Hamlet priest. Curse the fiends, their children too, and their children's children, forevermore. This wasn't just a wish for bad fortune. It was a cosmic working, a rewriting of reality itself. Kos reached across the boundary between life and death, between the material world and the dream realms, and she constructed a prison. The hunter's nightmare was designed with exquisite cruelty. It targets specifically those who had given in to the bloodlust of the hunt, those who had killed not out of necessity but out of pleasure, or the simple desire to kill. It pulls them in when they die, denying them rest or any progression to whatever afterlife might exist. And once trapped, they relive their worst impulses forever. The blood-drunk hunters who populate the nightmare are not simply insane. They're trapped in a loop, forced to hunt eternally, forced to feel the same rage and fury and need to kill that consumed them in life, but never able to satisfy that need. Every beast they kill simply respawns. Every hunter they strike down rises again. The hunt never ends. The bloodthirst never abates. They are trapped in their own desires, drowning in what they once craved most. This is the perfect revenge for what happened at the Fishing Hamlet. These scholars had killed an entire village in the pursuit of knowledge. They had given in to the worst impulses of their curiosity, let their desire to understand override all moral considerations. Now they and all hunters who followed in their footsteps would be trapped forever in their worst impulses, unable to escape, unable to grow, unable to be anything except what they had become in that moment of terrible choice. But the curse went further than just the hunters who'd been present at the hamlet. Their children too, and their children's children. The nightmare would claim all hunters who gave in to bloodlust, regardless of whether they had any connection to the original sin. Gehrman students would be claimed, their students in turn. Anyone who picked up a weapon in the hunt and felt that dark pleasure at the kill, who let the violence transform them into something other than human, would eventually find themselves pulled into Kos's eternal prison. The structure of the nightmare reflects this expanding web of guilt. The first layer, the streets of Nightmare Yarnum, represents the general corruption of the hunt itself, how the practice of killing beasts gradually transformed the hunters into beasts themselves. The research hall represents the church's sins, their experiments on living people in the pursuit of transcendence. And finally, the Fishing Hamlet, the deepest layer, represents the original sin, the source of everything that came after. Lady Maria serves as the guardian between the research hall and the Fishing Hamlet because her guilt is split. She was present for the massacre at the hamlet, making her complicit in the original sin, but she also could not stop thinking about the patients in the research hall, those volunteers who had trusted the church and been transformed into living experiments. Her position, guarding the threshold between two layers of nightmare, symbolizes someone caught between different kinds of guilt, unable to make peace with either. The research hall patients who call out for Maria don't realize she's dead. In the nightmare, time is not linear. For them, Maria might have just left moments ago, might return at any second with the kindness she showed them in life. They wait forever for mercy that will never come, just as the hunters hunt forever for satisfaction that will never arrive, just as the orphan cries forever for justice that can only come through violence. Some hunters trapped in the nightmare retain enough of their minds to understand what has happened to them. They know they're trapped. They know they'll never escape. This awareness doesn't free them. If anything, it makes their torment worse. To be insane would be a mercy compared to being aware of your eternal punishment while being unable to do anything, except continue the same violent behaviors that damned you in the first place. The orphan serves as the final boss of the nightmare, not because it created the nightmare, but because it represents the nightmare's purpose. Everything that came before was punishment for those who gave in to violence. Everything that came before was about forcing hunters to face the consequences of bloodlust. But the orphan is something else. The orphan is grief given form. It's the crystallization of every innocent who suffered because of the hunt, every victim who died for someone else's ambition, every child who lost their parent to violence they didn't understand. Fighting the orphan is not about overcoming bloodlust. It's about confronting the consequences of your actions, facing the suffering you caused, and accepting that some things cannot be forgiven or undone. Every hunter who reaches that beach must look at the orphan and see what their profession has created. Not beasts, not monsters, but this, an eternal infant screaming in rage and sorrow, denied the peace of death, trapped in nightmare because hunters went too far. When the orphan is defeated, when hunters strike down both its physical form and the phantom that represents its consciousness, they're not ending its suffering. The orphan doesn't die. It can't die. It's already dead, already beyond death, already in a state where normal mortality has no meaning. What hunters do by defeating the orphan is release it from its rage. They take on the burden of the curse themselves, metaphorically if not literally, allowing the orphan to finally stop fighting. This is why the storm calms after the orphan's defeat. The rage that powered it, that kept it churning for eternities, has been spent. The orphan has made hunters suffer as it suffered. The orphan has forced them to feel even a fraction of its pain. And now, finally, it can rest. Not die, but rest. The difference is crucial. The nightmare continues after the orphan falls. The blood-drunk hunters still hunt. The patients still call for Maria. The hamlet still exists in its state of frozen destruction. But something fundamental has changed. The heart of the nightmare, the source of its worst fury, has been calmed. The curse is still in effect, but its most terrible manifestation has been appeased. If you're enjoying this journey through Bloodborne's darkest tale, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button. It helps other people discover these deep dives into lore, and it means the world to me knowing that these stories connect with all of you. There's still so much more to explore about the orphan, Maria, and the tragedy that connects them all. Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower is intrinsically connected to the orphan story, not just as a guardian of the secret, but as someone whose entire existence was defined by what happened at the Fishing Hamlet. To understand the full tragedy of the orphan, we must understand Maria's guilt and what it drove her to do. Maria was born into nobility, a child of Cainhurst, the distant castle where an entire society had been built around blood magic. Cainhurst nobles were sorcerers and warriors who could manipulate their own blood and the blood of others, using it as a weapon, as a shield, as a source of supernatural power. The techniques were effective but disturbing, relying on self-harm and the spilling of blood in ways that seemed to violate the sanctity of the body. Maria rejected these techniques. From a young age, she showed extraordinary skill with traditional weapons, relying on speed and precision rather than supernatural power. She was drawn to the hunt, to the idea of protecting people from the beasts that plagued the countryside. When she came to Byrgenwerth and met Gehrman, she found in the first hunter someone who shared her philosophy. Skill over power, technique over magic. The hunt as a noble calling rather than simple slaughter. Gehrman took Maria as his student, and she quickly became one of his finest pupils. She mastered the rakuyo, a sword and dagger combination that required perfect timing and positioning. She learned to dance through combat, treating each encounter as a lethal ballet where every movement had to be precise. she developed her own style, combining Cainhurst's grace with Gehrman's practicality, creating a form of combat that was both beautiful and devastatingly effective. More than that, Maria and Gehrman developed a close relationship, whether it was romantic love, deep friendship, or something more complicated is unclear. What's certain is that Gehrman cared deeply for Maria, perhaps more than he had cared for anyone else. Later, when he was trapped in the hunter's dream, bound to serve the moon presence, Gehrman would create the doll in Maria's image, desperate for some connection to the woman he had lost. When Willem sent the expedition to the Fishing Hamlet, both Gehrman and Maria went. They were Willem's most trusted hunters, the ones best equipped to deal with any resistance. They probably expected a simple expedition, a quick trip to examine this dead great one that had been discovered. They certainly didn't expect what they found or what they would be asked to do. Maria watched the massacre. She watched as villagers, simple fisher folk who had done nothing wrong except protect something they held sacred, were cut down by trained hunters. She watched as the scholars cracked open skulls, searching for eyes in the brains of living people. She watched as the hamlet burned, as boats were overturned, as an entire community was destroyed for the sake of knowledge. Did she fight? Did she kill any of the villagers herself? We don't know for certain, but the evidence suggests she did. She was a hunter, after all, trained to fight and kill. When the villagers resisted, when they took up their fishing implements and tried to defend their home, Maria would have done what she'd been trained to do. She would have fought. She would have killed, all while knowing, on some level, that what was happening was wrong. The moment that probably broke Maria was when they reached Kos, when she stood before the corpse of the Great One and watched as scholars cut into the dead god, searching for the child within. When they found the orphan, whether alive or dead, and began the process of extraction. When they took the cord, the most intimate part of a mother-child connection, and treated it as just another sample to be studied. Maria had left Cainhurst partially because she was uncomfortable with blood magic, with the violation of the body that such techniques required, and now she stood, watching as an atrocity was committed that made Cainhurst's blood sorcery look gentle by comparison. The body of a god, pregnant or recently pregnant, being dissected like an animal. The villagers who had worshipped that god, their skulls opened and their brains examined while they still lived, all in the name of understanding, all for the sake of progress. When the expedition was finally over, when Byrgenwerth had what it came for and began preparations to leave, Maria made her decision. She found the well in the hamlet, that place where villagers had gathered in life, where they had drawn water and shared community, and she threw her rakuyo into its depths. This wasn't just discarding a weapon. The rakuyo was Maria's defining tool, the weapon she had mastered, the symbol of her identity as a hunter. By throwing it away, she was rejecting everything she had become. She could no longer stomach the hunt, could no longer pretend that what hunters did was noble or necessary or justified. She had seen the truth, and the truth was that hunters were murderers dressed in heroic rhetoric. Maria never hunted again after returning from the Fishing Hamlet. She gave up the blade entirely, refusing to fight even in self-defense. She probably spent her remaining time at the research hall, caring for the patients there, trying to ease their suffering as some form of penance for what she had allowed to happen. The patients remembered her kindness, remembered that she tried to help them when no one else would. But kindness to the research hall patients couldn't undo what had happened at the hamlet. Maria knew this. The guilt consumed her. She could see the faces of the villagers every time she closed her eyes. She could hear their screams, could remember the sound of skulls breaking under the tools of scholars searching for eyes. She could recall standing before Kos, watching the child being taken and doing nothing to stop it. Eventually, Maria took her own life. The exact method is unclear, but the result is certain. She died believing that death would bring escape from her memories, from her guilt, from the constant awareness of what she had done and failed to prevent. Instead, death brought her to the hunter's nightmare. Kos's curse claimed her, pulled her into the eternal prison constructed to punish those responsible for the massacre. But Maria's role in the nightmare is different from the blood-drunk hunters who populate its earlier layers. She isn't trapped in mindless violence. She isn't lost to the hunt. Instead, she has been given a purpose, and that purpose defines her existence in the nightmare. Maria guards the path to the fishing hamlet. She sits in the Astral Clocktower, motionless as a corpse, until someone tries to pass. Then she rises, and she fights with everything she has to prevent them from reaching the hamlet. She doesn't do this out of compulsion, or because she's controlled by the nightmare. She does it because she believes even now, even after everything, that the secret must be protected. Why? Why would Maria want to protect the secret of Byrgenwerth's crime? She'd rejected the hunt, rejected violence, rejected everything that led to the massacre. Yet here she stands, ready to kill anyone who tries to learn the truth about what happened at the hamlet. The answer lies in understanding Maria's relationship with guilt. She doesn't guard the hamlet to protect Byrgenwerth or to hide the scholar's actions. She guards it to protect herself and the other hunters from facing what they did. As long as the secret remains hidden, as long as no one reaches the hamlet and sees the truth, the hunters can maintain some pretense of nobility. They can tell themselves they're heroes fighting beasts, that their violence serves a greater good, that the hunt is justified. But if someone reaches the hamlet, if they see the bodies and hear the priest curse and understand what really happened, then the lie falls apart. The hunters become what they always were, murderers who slaughtered innocents for the sake of knowledge. Maria can't face that truth, even in the nightmare where the truth is inescapable. So she fights to preserve the lie, to maintain the fiction that maybe, somehow, the hunters weren't entirely in the wrong. This is why fighting Maria is so tragic. She moves with incredible grace, her attacks flowing together in seamless combinations that showcase the skill she spent a lifetime developing. She uses the blood magic she once rejected, her Canehurst heritage fully embraced now that there's no reason to hold back. Blood becomes fire, fire becomes fury, and through it all, Maria fights with a desperate intensity that speaks to someone protecting something precious. But she's not protecting the hamlet, she's not protecting the villagers or their memory, she's protecting herself from the full weight of her own guilt. And when she falls, when hunters finally break through her defense, Maria faces the ultimate punishment. She must watch as someone else goes to the hamlet, must know that the secret is finally revealed, must accept that the lie she's been fighting to preserve has failed. In her final moments, Maria doesn't curse the hunters who defeated her. She doesn't plead with them not to go to the hamlet. She simply accepts her defeat with the same grace she showed in life. Because on some level, Maria knows this is right. The truth should be revealed. The secret should be exposed. She's been trying to hide it because she couldn't bear to face it herself, but that doesn't mean it should stay hidden forever. After Maria falls, hunters can retrieve her weapon, the rakuyo, from the well where she threw it. The weapon is still there, preserved perfectly despite however much time has passed. Retrieving it requires descending into the well, into the darkness and water, emerging in a cavern where the same creatures that infested Kos now swarm and attack. Fighting through them to reach the rakuyo feels like a baptism in reverse, a descent into corruption rather than cleansing. The rakuyo, when retrieved, feels different from most weapons in Bloodborne. It's elegant, precise, requiring skill to use effectively. It doesn't have the raw power of heavier weapons or the supernatural abilities of trick weapons that transform in spectacular ways. It's simply a sword and dagger that reward good timing and positioning. It's Maria's philosophy made physical, skill over power, technique over magic, the belief that a hunter should rely on their own abilities rather than borrowed strength. Using the rakuyo after learning Maria's story adds a layer of melancholy to every fight. This was the weapon she mastered, the tool she used to become one of the greatest hunters of her generation, and she threw it away because she couldn't stomach what she had done with it. Every time a hunter wields the rakuyo in combat, they're carrying on Maria's legacy while also being reminded of why she abandoned it. Maria's relationship with Gehrman adds another dimension to her tragedy. Gehrman was trapped in the hunter's dream, bound to serve the moon presence, forced to guide an endless succession of hunters through their own nightmares. He created the doll in Maria's image, probably hoping it would comfort him, give him some connection to the woman he had lost. But the doll isn't Maria. It moves like her, speaks with her voice, but it's a pale imitation, a construct that mimics the surface without capturing the depth. And Gehrman knows this. He treats the doll with kindness but also with distance, unable to fully accept this false version of someone he cared deeply for. Sometimes, if a hunter returns to the dream at the right moment, they can see Gehrman kneeling by the doll, whispering to it as though it's really Maria, as though she can hear him. "You were at my side all along, my guiding moonlight," Gehrman murmurs in his sleep, possibly to Maria's memory. These words reveal the depth of his loss. Maria wasn't just his student or his friend, she was his inspiration, his reason for continuing when the hunt became too dark. And he lost her, first to guilt and suicide, then to the nightmare where he could never reach her. In the hunter's nightmare, Maria and Gehrman are separated by layers of reality. He's trapped in the dream, bound to the moon presence. She's trapped in the nightmare, cursed by Kos. Both are paying for their sins, but they're paying separately, unable to comfort each other, unable to share the burden of guilt that weighs on them both. Even their punishments isolate them from the one person who might understand their suffering. This isolation is part of Kos's curse. It would be too easy if Maria and Gehrman could be together, if they could find some comfort in shared guilt. Instead, they're separated, each alone with their memories, each trapped in their own version of hell. The curse doesn't just punish, it maximizes suffering, ensuring that every aspect of the punishment cuts as deeply as possible. The actual combat encounter with the Orphan of Kos represents the culmination of everything the hunter's nightmare has been building toward. Every other boss in the nightmare was preparation, each one testing a different aspect of a hunter's skills. Ludwig the Accursed tested your ability to deal with chaotic, unpredictable movements. The living failures tested your crowd control and patience. Lady Maria tested your precision and timing. But the orphan tests everything simultaneously, while adding one more element: your ability to maintain composure in the face of something fundamentally heartbreaking. The approach to the fight is significant. Hunters who have made it through the hamlet, past all the transformed villagers and the priest's curses, finally reach the shore. The beach stretches out before them, dark sand wet with seawater, lit by the sickly glow of the nightmare sky. And there, impossible to miss, is the corpse of Kos. Up close, Kos is even more massive than she appeared. From a distance, the body's clearly decomposing, even in this nightmare state, covered in barnacles and sea growth, with pieces torn away or rotted through. But there's still a majesty to the form, a sense that this was once a being of incredible power and presence. The face, what's visible of it, has an almost serene expression, as though Kos found peace in death, even while her child found only rage. The orphan emerges slowly. At first, it might not be clear what you're looking at. Movement from within Kos's ribcage, something pale pushing through the gaps between bones. Then more movement, deliberate now, intentional. And then the orphan stands, pulling itself fully free of its mother's corpse, straightening to its full height, and the true horror of what you're facing becomes clear. This is a child, not metaphorically, not symbolically. The orphan is, developmentally, an infant great one. It should be small and helpless, depending on its mother for everything, not yet capable of independent existence. Instead, it's been forced into awareness and action, its consciousness active when it should still be forming, its body functional when it should still be developing. The nightmare has warped it, or perhaps the trauma of its death and forced rebirth has, but the essential nature remains. This is a baby. When the orphan looks up at the sky and cries, hunters who are paying attention will notice something crucial. It's not looking at them. It's not acknowledging their presence at all. In this moment, the orphan isn't aware of or concerned with hunters. It's grieving, purely and simply, expressing the sorrow that defines its existence. The crying lasts for several seconds, and hunters could probably attack during this time, get in free damage while the orphan is distracted. But many hunters find themselves unable to attack in this moment. The sight of this creature, this impossible infant, crying over its mother's corpse is too pathetic, too tragic. Even knowing it's a monster, even knowing the fight is inevitable, the image creates hesitation. This is part of what makes the orphan so effective as the final boss of the nightmare. It makes you question what you're about to do, forces you to confront the fact that you're about to kill a child, albeit one that's simultaneously a god and already dead. When the orphan notices hunters, the transformation is instantaneous. The crying stops, the body goes rigid, then the head turns, and those two large eyes focus with terrible intensity on the intruder, and the screaming begins. The first phase of the fight is aggressive but still somewhat grounded. The orphan moves quickly but predictably, swinging the placenta weapon in arcs that can be dodged with good timing. It jumps forward to close distance, attacks in combinations that flow together naturally, occasionally throws pieces of energy that explode on impact. This phase feels like fighting a beast, something animal and instinctual, dangerous but understandable. The key to surviving this phase is recognizing that the orphan is testing you. Every attack pattern is distinct, can be learned and countered. The placenta swings have specific timing. The jumps are telegraphed. The throws can be dodged or avoided by maintaining distance. If you can remain calm, can resist the urge to panic and start rolling randomly, you can survive. But the pressure is constant. The Orphan never stops attacking, never gives you more than a second or two to recover stamina or heal. Then comes the transition. When the Orphan's health drops below a certain threshold, it pauses mid-combat. It looks at its placenta weapon, at this piece of its mother that it's been using to fight. And it bites it, tears at it with its teeth, not to damage hunters but to damage itself, to transform itself into something more capable of expressing the rage that consumes it. The membrane on its back spreads, unfurling into wing-like structures that catch air even though they clearly shouldn't be able to support flight. The placenta hardens, lengthens, transforms into something more resembling a scythe or halberd, with the fishing hook still embedded at its tip, and the Orphan itself changes, its body taking on a slightly more robust form, its movements becoming faster and more frantic. Phase 2 is where many hunters fail. The Orphan abandons all restraint, attacking with combinations that seem to have no end, leaping into the air and staying there for impossible lengths of time, crashing down with area of effect attacks that damage everything nearby. It can call lightning from Kos's corpse, bolts that track hunters and explode with devastating force. It throws blood, its own or something else, which splatters across the beach and explodes after a short delay. Most terrifying is when the Orphan takes flight properly. It launches itself skyward, hovering overhead, and becomes almost impossible to track. Hunters on the ground can only watch as the Orphan positions itself, then crashes down with an attack that combines physical impact, area of effect damage, and often lightning strikes all at once. The safe zones for these attacks are tiny, requiring precise positioning and perfect timing to avoid. Throughout the fight, the Orphan never stops screaming. That sound becomes the backdrop to everything, a constant reminder of the suffering you're both inflicting and trying to end. The scream changes in intensity depending on what the Orphan is doing, louder when it's attacking, more pained when it's hurt, reaching peak intensity during the phase transition. Some hunters report that the sound follows them even after the fight, that they hear that scream in quiet moments, a haunting reminder of what they encountered. The arena for the fight is deceptively simple. It's just a beach, with Kos's corpse at one end and water stretching into darkness at the other. But this simplicity is part of what makes the fight so challenging. There are no obstacles to hide behind, no environmental features to use for advantage. It's just hunter and Orphan, facing each other on open sand, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The water poses its own hazard. If hunters retreat too far back into the ocean, they start taking damage from some unseen source. Perhaps it's the same corruption that fills Kos, seeping from the corpse into the surrounding water. Perhaps it's just the nightmare enforcing the boundaries of the arena. Either way, hunters must stay close to shore, limiting their movement options, forcing them to engage rather than retreat. What makes the Orphan fight particularly brutal is how it punishes mistakes. Most bosses in Bloodborne give you some recovery time after they land a hit, a brief moment to heal or reposition. The Orphan doesn't. If it catches you with an attack, it immediately follows up with another one, then another, creating combos that can kill a hunter from full health if they're not careful. The only way to survive is to avoid getting hit in the first place, which requires perfect execution under enormous pressure. Some hunters approach the orphan with the standard Bloodborne strategy of aggressive play, staying close and attacking constantly. This can work, but requires incredible timing and an intimate knowledge of the orphan's moveset. One mistake, one moment of being too greedy with your attacks, and you're dead. Other hunters prefer a more cautious approach, dodging and waiting for specific openings. This is safer but makes the fight longer, giving the orphan more opportunities to catch you with its more dangerous attacks. There's no easy strategy, no simple trick that makes the orphan manageable. Every hunter must find their own approach, learning through repeated attempts what works for their playstyle. And even when you think you've learned the patterns, even when you're confident in your ability to dodge and counter, the orphan will surprise you with a combo you haven't seen before, or will chain attacks in an unexpected order. When the orphan finally falls, when its health is depleted and the physical form can no longer sustain itself, there's a moment of anticlimax. The body doesn't explode or fade dramatically, it simply falls, collapsing onto the sand near its mother's corpse. The screaming stops, the frenetic movement ceases, and for a moment it seems like the fight is over. Then the Black Phantom appears. This is the orphan's true form, or perhaps its soul hovering above Kos's body. It's agitated, moving in distress, clearly upset by what has just occurred. Some hunters interpret this as the orphan mourning its physical form. Others think it's finally realizing it can escape the nightmare, can move beyond this prison. Either way, the phantom must be destroyed to complete the fight, to fully release the orphan from its curse. The phantom doesn't fight back. It drifts and moves, but makes no attempt to attack. Striking it down feels less like combat and more like mercy killing, putting down something that's suffering and can't help itself. When the final blow lands, when the phantom dissipates, the change in the nightmare is immediate and profound. The storm stops, the lightning ceases, the rain, which has been falling constantly since hunters first entered this layer of the nightmare, finally ends. The sky begins to clear, not to brightness, but to the same wan, sickly glow that permeates the rest of the nightmare. But even that is an improvement over the tempest that has raged overhead throughout the hamlet. Some hunters report feeling a presence leaving after the orphan is defeated, a sense of something vast and angry finally departing. Perhaps it's Kos herself, or what remained of her consciousness, finally satisfied that justice has been served. Perhaps it's just the curse lifting, the mechanism of the nightmare adjusting to accommodate the orphan's release. Either way, the beach feels different after the fight. Quieter, calmer, somehow more at peace despite still being part of an eternal nightmare. The story of the Orphan of Kos operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it's about hunters invading a village, committing atrocities, and facing supernatural punishment. But dig deeper, and you find a story that explores themes of motherhood, violation, grief, and the impossible question of what we owe to beings we've harmed. Motherhood is central to Bloodborne's entire narrative structure. The game is obsessed with mothers and children, with the failure of birth, with the tragedy of offspring that cannot survive. Every great one loses its child. This simple phrase appears repeatedly, becoming almost a mantra. It's not just a rule about how great ones reproduce, it's a statement about cosmic unfairness, about how even beings of godlike power must face the most fundamental grief imaginable. Queen Yharnam lost her child, murdered before it could be born, its blood used to create the terrible plague that would eventually consume the city. Ebrietas, daughter of the Cosmos, is herself described as a daughter, implying a mother somewhere, but she was left behind when other Great Ones departed, orphaned in her own way. The Moon Presence seeks a surrogate, binding Gehrman to the hunter's dream in hopes that this proxy relationship can fulfill the need for a child. Even Murgo, the nightmare infant whose cry echoes through the nightmare of Mensis, represents the same theme, a child of a Great One, existing in some strange state between life and death. Kos and the orphan represent the purest expression of this theme. Here we have a mother who somehow managed to conceive and carry a child to term, breaking the curse that afflicts all Great Ones. The pregnancy itself was a miracle, an impossibility made real, and then humans came and destroyed it. They killed the mother, killed or stole the child, and desecrated the bond between them in the pursuit of knowledge. The violation here is not just physical but symbolic. The umbilical cord that Byrgenwerth sought represents more than a biological connection. In the context of Great Ones, the cord is the mechanism by which higher consciousness is transmitted from parent to child. It's both a physical organ and a metaphysical bridge, carrying not just nutrients but understanding, wisdom, the ability to perceive reality in all its dimensions. By taking the orphan's cord, the scholars weren't just stealing flesh, they were severing the connection between mother and child, preventing the transmission of everything Kos might have wanted to give to her offspring. They were ensuring that even if the orphan survived in some form, it would be cut off from its inheritance, unable to become what it should have been. This makes the orphan's state in the nightmare even more tragic. It's not just that the orphan was killed before birth or shortly after. It's that it was denied the knowledge and power that should have been its birthright. The cord was taken, studied by humans who could never truly understand what they held, probably consumed by Willem or his successors, in the belief that they could gain insight from it. The orphan was left incomplete, a god robbed of godhood, an inheritor without inheritance. The imagery of the orphan wielding its own placenta as a weapon is painfully symbolic. The placenta should have been a source of nourishment, the mechanism by which the mother sustained the child. Instead, it becomes a weapon, the only tool the orphan has to express its rage. The fishing hook embedded in the placenta compounds this symbolism, the tool of the villagers' trade, perhaps the very implement that was used during the scholars' dissection of Kos, now repurposed as an instrument of violence. Every time the orphan swings its placenta weapon, it's attacking with the remnants of its own birth, using what should have been a symbol of maternal care as a means of destruction. This inversion of natural order, this transformation of creation into violence perfectly captures what the Fishing Hamlet massacre did to the natural cycle of life. The relationship between Kos and the villagers also speaks to themes of motherhood in unexpected ways. The villagers treated Kos as more than just a deity. They drew sustenance from her body even in death, used the parasites that grew within her to transform themselves, essentially making themselves children of Kos in a spiritual if not literal sense. When the scholars came and desecrated Kos, they weren't just attacking a god, they were attacking the villagers' mother figure, the source of everything that had made their lives meaningful. This creates a parallel between the villagers and the orphan. Both are children of Kos in different ways. Both were sustained by her. Both were protected by her. And both were violated when the scholars came. The villagers had their skulls opened and their brains examined while alive. The orphan had its cord severed and was killed or stolen. The methods differed, but the fundamental crime was the same, treating living beings as objects to be studied rather than as individuals with inherent worth. Maria's guilt takes on new dimensions when viewed through the lens of motherhood. She watched mothers killed, families destroyed, a pregnant deity desecrated. As a woman, as someone who could potentially become a mother herself, the sight must have been uniquely horrifying. The violation of the maternal bond, the destruction of the most sacred relationship in nature, would have resonated with Maria in ways that male hunters might not have fully grasped. This might explain why Maria's defense of the secret is so absolute. She's not just protecting the truth of what happened. She's protecting herself from having to admit that she stood by while the bond between mother and child was destroyed, that she allowed the most fundamental violation to occur without intervention. The guilt of witnessing the Fishing Hamlet massacre is compounded by the specifically maternal nature of the crime. The doll, created in Maria's image, represents another twisted take on motherhood. Gehrman made the doll comfort himself, but in doing so, he created a being that serves all hunters who pass through the dream. The doll cares for hunters, helps them level up, offers words of encouragement and kindness. She performs the role of nurturer, of someone who provides support without judgment. In essence, she's a surrogate mother to countless hunters, each one passing through the dream on their way to death or madness. But the doll isn't human. She's a construct, an object animated by some power we don't fully understand. Her care is programmed, not chosen. Her nurturing is automatic, not intentional. She's a mockery of motherhood in the same way that the orphan wielding its placenta is a mockery of maternal care. Both represent natural relationships warped by unnatural circumstances into something that superficially resembles the original but is fundamentally hollow. The theme of stolen children appears throughout the entire Bloodborne narrative. The School of Mensis attempted to summon Murgo, the nightmare infant, believing they could control or commune with it. Instead, they doomed themselves, their consciousnesses trapped in the nightmare they created. The Healing Church experimented on living people, transforming them into kin, creating artificial relationships between humans and Great Ones through forced evolution rather than natural connection. Every attempt to artificially create or control the relationship between parent and child, between creator and creation, ends in disaster. This is what makes the crime at the Fishing Hamlet so perfectly emblematic of Bloodborne's themes. The scholars saw a natural relationship between a Great One and her child, a relationship that had succeeded where all others failed, and they destroyed it. They couldn't let it exist on its own terms. They had to understand it, to dissect it, to take it apart, and see how it worked. And in doing so, they destroyed the very thing they wanted to comprehend. The orphan's eternal rage makes perfect sense in this context. It's not just anger at being killed, it's fury at being robbed of its mother, robbed of its birthright, robbed of the knowledge and power that should have been transmitted through the cord, robbed even of the dignity of proper death. The orphan exists in a state of perpetual loss, forever denied everything it should have had, and its screaming is the only way it can express the magnitude of that loss. When hunters fight the orphan, they're not facing a monster. They're facing grief made manifest. Every attack is an expression of sorrow, every scream a cry for something that can never be returned. The fight is not about good versus evil or even hunter versus beast. It's about confronting the consequences of violation, about facing someone whose entire existence is defined by what was taken from them, and accepting that some wounds can never heal. The calming of the storm after the orphan's defeat represents a kind of peace, but not resolution. The orphan is released from its rage, but it's not reunited with Kos. The villagers are not brought back to life. The crime is not undone. What's achieved is simply the ending of active suffering, the transition from furious grief to quiet mourning. It's not redemption, it's just the cessation of the worst pain, leaving behind a sadness that will never fully go away. The Astral Clocktower serves as more than just the arena for fighting Lady Maria. It's a threshold between states of being, a mechanism that operates on principles that transcend normal time and space. Understanding the clock tower helps us understand how the nightmare functions and what it means that the Fishing Hamlet exists at the deepest layer. The clock tower's name is significant. Astral suggests something related to the stars, to the cosmos, to realms beyond normal material existence. The research hall patients speak of making contact with the cosmos, of gaining eyes to see the truth of reality. The entire structure of the research hall and the clock tower represents the healing church's attempt to facilitate this contact, to create a space where humans could touch the divine. But the clock itself is wrong. When Maria is defeated and the mechanism activates, the face doesn't show regular time. The hands move in ways that suggest different measurements altogether, perhaps tracking the progression of states of consciousness, or the alignment of celestial bodies, or something even more abstract. Whatever it's measuring, it's not seconds and minutes. It's something that humans weren't meant to perceive. The passage through the clock tower is transformative. Hunters enter from the research hall, from a space that still has some connection to the material world, however tenuous. They emerge in the Fishing Hamlet, which exists in a deeper layer of the nightmare, further removed from normal reality. The clock tower serves as a bridge between these states, allowing passage from one to the other while marking the crossing as significant. What makes this passage particularly meaningful is that it's one way. Hunters can move from the research hall to the hamlet, but returning requires using a different mechanism entirely. This suggests that the descent into the hamlet is a fundamental change, a crossing of a threshold that cannot be easily uncrossed. You can return physically, but something about you has changed by witnessing what lies at the hamlet. You know something you didn't know before, and that knowledge cannot be unknown. The architecture of the clock tower itself is fascinating. It's built in a style that matches neither the research hall nor the hamlet. The stonework is different, the decorative elements unique. It exists as a distinct structure, architecturally separate from both the spaces it connects. This reinforces the idea that the clock tower is a threshold, belonging fully to neither side but serving as the boundary between them. Maria's chamber within the clock tower is sparse, containing only a chair and a few scattered items. She sits facing the entrance, positioned so that anyone approaching the clock tower's mechanism must pass directly in front of her. The room has no decorations, no personal items, nothing that would suggest Maria has made this space her own. It's a guard post, nothing more, and Maria's presence here is defined entirely by her function as guardian. This is tragic in its own right. In life, Maria was a complex person with interests and relationships, and an identity beyond her role as a hunter. In the nightmare, all of that has been stripped away. She exists only to protect the secret, to prevent passage to the hamlet. Everything else about who she was has become irrelevant. the nightmare has reduced her to a single function, just as it has reduced the blood-drunk hunters to eternal violence and the orphan to eternal grief. The connection between the clock tower and time itself raises interesting questions about the nature of the nightmare. If the clock is measuring something other than normal time, and if the nightmare exists outside normal temporal flow, then what does it mean for events in the nightmare to have consequences? When hunters defeat Maria and pass through the hamlet, are they accessing a memory of what happened? Or are they somehow travelling to the actual moment of the massacre? Or is it something else entirely? The answer might be all of these simultaneously. The nightmare operates on dream logic, where past, present and future can coexist, where symbolic truth is as real as literal truth. The hamlet in the nightmare is simultaneously a recreation of the past event, a memory preserved in cosmic amber, and a living space where the curse continues to operate. Time is not linear here. The massacre is always happening and has always happened and will never stop happening. The clock tower allows passage into this state of temporal paradox. This helps explain why defeating the orphan has such profound effects. If the hamlet exists in a state where time is not linear, then the orphan's release doesn't just affect the present moment, it ripples backward and forward, changing the fundamental nature of what the hamlet represents. The storm that clears after the orphan falls has been raging since the massacre and has never started because it's always been there. Both are true in the nightmare's logic. The Astral Clocktower also connects to broader themes in Bloodborne about insight and perception. The game teaches that insight, the ability to perceive cosmic truth, comes with a terrible price. The more you see, the more vulnerable you become. Enemies that were invisible become visible and they can hurt you. The world becomes more threatening the better you understand it. Passing through the clock tower is an act of gaining insight. You learn the truth about what happened at the Fishing Hamlet, understand the original sin that created the hunter's nightmare. But this knowledge doesn't empower you. It doesn't make you stronger or more capable. Instead, it forces you to confront the orphan, to face the consequences of insight without any of the benefits. You see the truth, and the truth is horrifying, and seeing it obligates you to deal with it. Maria guards this threshold because she understands what lies beyond it. She knows that anyone who passes through the clock tower will learn something that will change them fundamentally. They will see the Fishing Hamlet in all its tragedy. They will understand what hunters are truly capable of when they abandon moral restraint. They will witness the birth of the nightmare from its original source, and none of that knowledge will bring anything except more suffering. Yet Maria can't ultimately stop anyone. She's a powerful opponent, but determined hunters can defeat her. The clock tower will activate. The passage will open. The secret will be revealed. This inevitability is part of Maria's tragedy. She's been appointed to guard something that cannot be protected forever, to keep a secret that must eventually come to light. Her entire existence in the nightmare is built around a task she will ultimately fail at, and she knows it. When the clock tower opens and hunters pass through, they find themselves on a different beach altogether. The architecture changes, the atmosphere shifts, even the water seems different, more corrupt, more hostile. This is not just a different physical location, it's a different state of reality, a place where the rules are not quite the same, where the nightmare has had longer to fester and corrupt everything it touches. The descent from the clock tower to the hamlet proper requires navigating through a cave system, dark and filled with the same parasites that infested Kos. This passage serves as another threshold, a final transition before reaching the hamlet itself. The parasites attack viciously, defending the path to the hamlet as though following some instinct to protect what lies ahead. Or perhaps they're defending Kos herself, still serving their dead goddess even in this nightmare state. Emerging from the caves into the hamlet feels like surfacing from deep water. The air changes, the light, such as it is, becomes different, and spread out before hunters is the fishing hamlet itself, frozen in its moment of destruction, waiting with terrible patience for someone to witness what happened here and face the consequences. The crime at the fishing hamlet didn't just create the hunter's nightmare, it influenced the entire trajectory of events that followed, shaping the world of Bloodborne in ways that reverberate through every aspect of the game's narrative. When Byrgenwerth returned from the hamlet with the orphan's cord, Willem achieved what he had been seeking. He consumed the cord, or used it in some ritual that granted him insight into the cosmic truth. His brain became lined with eyes, allowing him to perceive reality in dimensions that normal humans could not access. He could see the Great Ones, understand their nature, comprehend the structure of reality itself. But this knowledge came at a cost. Willem became increasingly withdrawn, spending his time in Byrgenwerth's library, staring at the lake where he had once discovered the entrance to the Thumerian labyrinths. His students grew concerned about his obsession. Worried that he was losing himself in the pursuit of understanding, some began to question whether the insight they had gained was worth the price they paid for it. One of Willem's students was Lawrence, a young scholar who believed that understanding alone was not enough. Lawrence wanted to use the knowledge they had gained to apply it in ways that would benefit humanity. Where Willem preached caution, fear the old blood, Lawrence saw opportunity. Blood had transformative properties. If they could harness those properties, control them, they could cure disease, extend life, perhaps even allow humans to evolve beyond their current limitations. The split between Willem and Lawrence was not acrimonious, at least not initially. Lawrence left Byrgenwerth to found the Healing Church, taking with him the knowledge gained from the fishing hamlet and the samples collected during that expedition. He promised Willem that he would remember the lesson, that he would fear the old blood even as he sought to use it. But promises made in good faith are often broken by good intentions. The Healing Church became obsessed with blood. They discovered that blood ministration, the practice of transfusing specially treated blood into patients, could cure illnesses, heal injuries, even grant enhanced strength and vitality. The people of Yharnam flocked to the church, desperate for the miracles that blood healing promised. The church grew powerful and influential, its ministrations becoming so widespread that entire generations of Yharnam citizens had blood healing integrated into their medical care. But the blood the church used wasn't ordinary. Some of it came from Ebrietas, the Great One discovered in the Thumerian labyrinths. Some came from other sources, possibly including samples taken from Kos. The transformative properties that made the blood effective for healing also carried dangers. Prolonged exposure changed people. Some became stronger and more vital, yes, but others began to transform in more radical ways, their bodies twisting into bestial forms, their minds degrading into animal savagery. This is how the Scourge of Beasts began. It wasn't a disease in the traditional sense, it was a consequence of blood ministration, a side effect of using Great One blood to heal human ailments. The people who became beasts had been trying to improve themselves. to become healthier and stronger. Instead, they lost their humanity entirely, transforming into the very monsters that hunters would later be employed to kill. The creation of the hunt itself traces back to the fishing hamlet. Gehrman, who'd been present for the massacre, became the first hunter. He trained others in the art of killing, developing the weapons and techniques that would define Yharnam's hunters for generations. Every trick weapon, every hunter's tool, every tactic used to track and kill beasts can be traced back to Gehrman's influence. And Gehrman learned his craft during the period when Byrgenwerth was conducting its most aggressive research, when scholars were willing to do anything to gain understanding. The hunters that Gehrman trained were not originally meant to kill beasts. They were protectors, guards for scholars who ventured into dangerous places like the Pthumerian labyrinths, or expeditions to distant locations like the fishing hamlet. But as the beast scourge grew, as more and more people in Yharnam began to transform, the focus of the hunt shifted. Hunters became beast slayers, specialized killers tasked with putting down transformed humans before they could harm others. This created a terrible cycle. Blood ministration transformed people into beasts. Hunters killed those beasts. But the stress and trauma of constantly killing, of wading through blood and violence night after night, drove many hunters themselves to madness. They became blood drunk, addicted to the violence, unable to stop killing even when the beasts were gone. And these blood-drunk hunters were eventually claimed by the hunter's nightmare, pulled into Kos's, cursed to suffer for eternity. The nightmare thus became a self-perpetuating system. The original sin at the fishing hamlet created the curse. The curse claimed blood-drunk hunters. But the very existence of the hunt, which was necessitated by the consequences of blood ministration, which itself stemmed from knowledge gained at the hamlet, ensured a constant supply of new victims for the curse to claim. Every generation of hunters produced more blood-drunk killers. Every blood-drunk killer eventually died and was pulled into the nightmare. The cycle never ended. The research hall, where the healing church experimented on living patients, was another direct consequence of the fishing hamlet. The scholars who opened villagers' skulls searching for eyes had proven that such research could yield results, however monstrous the methods. The church took this lesson and applied it systematically, transforming volunteers into experimental subjects, exposing their brains to Great One fluids, searching desperately for the insight that would allow humans to transcend their limitations. Some of the research hall patients did develop eyes, growing them in places eyes should never be. But these eyes didn't grant understanding or transcendence. They just made the patients more aware of their own suffering, more conscious of what had been done to them, without providing any ability to escape or resist. The church's research had again proven that you could force transformation, but transformation forced upon unwilling subjects never led anywhere good. Lady Maria's presence at both the fishing hamlet and the research hall links these two atrocities. She witnessed the original crime and was unable to stop it. She later tried to care for the research hall patients, perhaps as penance, perhaps just because someone needed to show them kindness. But her kindness couldn't undo what the church had done any more than it could undo what Byrgenwerth had done. Both institutions had crossed. Lines that should never be crossed, had violated people in the pursuit of knowledge, and no amount of after-the-fact compassion could make that right. The influence of the fishing hamlet extended even to the other nightmares that hunters could encounter. Murgo's wet nurse, the being that protected the nightmare infant, shared some characteristics with Kos. Both were maternal figures presiding over nightmare realms. Both were connected to children who existed in strange states between life and death. The parallel suggests that Kos's curse might have created a template, a pattern that other nightmares followed, spreading the concept of nightmare as punishment beyond just the hunter's nightmare. The moon presence itself, the entity that bound Gehrman to the hunter's dream, might have been influenced by or responding to the existence of Kos's curse. If Great Ones sought surrogates because they could not have children of their own, and if Kos's successful pregnancy represented a threat or opportunity, then the moon presence's creation of the hunter's dream might have been an attempt to create its own version of that success. By binding hunters to the dream, by using them as tools, perhaps the moon presence was trying to manufacture the parent-child relationship it could not naturally achieve. Every major event in Bloodborne's narrative can be traced back, directly or indirectly, to what happened at the Fishing Hamlet. The scholars' desire for knowledge led them to commit atrocities. Those atrocities yielded insight that allowed the founding of the Healing Church. The Church's blood ministration created the Beast Scourge. The Beast Scourge necessitated the hunt. The hunt created blood-drunk hunters. Blood-drunk hunters were claimed by the nightmare, and the nightmare existed to punish those responsible for the original sin. It's a chain of cause and effect that spans decades or even centuries, each link forged by someone's choice to pursue knowledge or power or understanding at the expense of moral considerations. No single person intended the full catastrophe. Willem just wanted to gain eyes. Lawrence just wanted to help people through blood healing. Gehrman just wanted to protect scholars, and later to protect people from beasts. Maria just wanted to be a noble hunter defending the innocent. But intentions don't matter when the methods are monstrous. Each person in this chain made choices that seemed justifiable at the time, that served what they believed were good purposes. And collectively, those choices created a nightmare that would claim thousands of victims, a curse that would span generations, a cycle of violence and transformation and punishment that might never truly end. The orphan stands at the center of all of this, a being that never asked to exist, that was violated before it could even be born, that became the focal point for cosmic revenge against those who committed the original sin. Every hunter who falls to the curse is paying for what happened to the orphan. Every patient in the research hall suffered because scholars learned that you could crack open skulls looking for eyes. Every beast in Yharnam exists because the church tried to use knowledge gained through atrocity. The orphan doesn't know this, of course. It cannot comprehend the full scope of its influence, the way its suffering has echoed through time and space to shape the world. It only knows rage and grief, only understands that it was wronged and wants those responsible to suffer. But the cosmic mechanisms that responded to its violation, that created the nightmare and enforced the curse, those mechanisms understood. They took the orphan's pain and weaponized it, transforming personal tragedy into universal punishment. This is what makes the orphan so central to Bloodborne's themes. It's not just another boss, not just another obstacle for hunters to overcome. It's the nexus point where all the game's themes of motherhood, violation, the cost of knowledge, and the consequences of treating living beings as objects intersect. Fighting the orphan is fighting the accumulated weight of every sin committed in the pursuit of understanding, facing the grief that results when empathy is abandoned for the sake of progress. As we come to the end of the orphan's tale, we're left with uncomfortable truths and questions that have no easy answers. The story of Kos and the orphan is not a simple narrative of good versus evil. It's a tragedy in the classical sense, where well-intentioned people make terrible choices, where the pursuit of noble goals leads to monstrous outcomes, where suffering begets more suffering in an endless cycle. The fishing hamlet was a peaceful place before the scholars came. The villagers lived simple lives, made better by their connection to Kos, transformed by the parasites they harvested with reverence and gratitude. They weren't innocents in the fairy tale sense. They were real people with their own lives and concerns and flaws, but they didn't deserve what happened to them. No one deserves to have their skulls opened while alive, to watch their homes burn, to see their deity desecrated and their sacred child stolen. The scholars of Byrgenwerth were not monsters. They were intellectuals driven by curiosity, by the desire to understand reality in all its complexity. Willem genuinely believed that gaining eyes, developing the ability to perceive cosmic truth, would elevate humanity. He thought knowledge was always valuable. That understanding could only be a good thing. He was wrong, but his wrongness came from earnest belief, not malicious intent. German and Maria were hunters trying to protect people. They developed their skills to fight beasts and guard scholars exploring dangerous places. They probably saw themselves as heroes, or at least as people doing necessary work in a dangerous world. And then they found themselves at the fishing hamlet, participants in an atrocity, unable to reconcile what they were doing with their self-image as protectors. The healing church took the knowledge gained from the hamlet and tried to use it to help people. Blood ministration worked, at least initially. It cured diseases, healed injuries, improved lives. That it eventually created the beast scourge was not the church's intention. They were trying to help, and they destroyed themselves and everyone they touched in the process. And at the centre of all these well-intentioned actors and their terrible choices, there's the orphan, a child that never got to live, trapped in eternal suffering, transformed into an instrument of cosmic vengeance. The orphan didn't choose this role. It didn't decide to become the avatar of punishment for all blood-drunk hunters. It's a victim that has been forced to perpetuate the cycle of violence, to inflict on others the pain that was inflicted upon it. This is the deepest tragedy of the orphan's existence. It has become exactly what it should hate most: a killer. Everyone who fights the orphan and dies becomes another victim of violence, another person whose life is ended by force. The orphan has been transformed from victim into perpetrator, forced to participate in the very cycle of violence that created it. Even as it punishes those responsible for the massacre, it's perpetuating the same pattern of harm. When hunters finally defeat the orphan, when they release it from its rage and allow the storm to calm, they're not fixing what happened at the fishing hamlet. The villagers are still dead. Kos is still a corpse on the beach. The cord is still gone, the connection between mother and child still severed. All that changes is that the active expression of rage ceases, transforming into quiet grief. It's not redemption. It's not even really resolution. It's just stopping. The violence ends not because justice has been achieved, but because all parties are too exhausted to continue. This lack of true resolution is part of what makes the orphan's story so affecting. In most narratives, defeating the final boss brings closure. Evil is vanquished, order is restored, the world is saved. But defeating the orphan doesn't save anything. The nightmare continues. The curse remains in effect for future blood-drunk hunters. The chain of cause and effect that started at the Fishing Hamlet and led to the founding of the Healing Church and the creation of the Beast Scourge still exists in the past, unchangeable and irrevocable. What defeating the Orphan accomplishes is simply witnessing. By reaching the Fishing Hamlet, by learning the truth of what happened there, by facing the Orphan and understanding the depth of its suffering, hunters bear witness to the original sin. They cannot undo it, cannot fix it, cannot make it right. But they can acknowledge that it happened, that it was wrong, that the suffering it caused was real and profound. This act of witnessing is perhaps the only form of justice the Orphan can receive. Not revenge, which the curse has already provided through the eternal punishment of blood-drunk hunters. Not restoration, which is impossible given the permanence of death, but acknowledgement. Someone finally knows the full truth of what happened. Someone has seen the Orphan's suffering and recognized it as suffering rather than just as an obstacle to be overcome. The calming of the storm after the Orphan's defeat suggests that this witnessing matters, that being seen and acknowledged provides some measure of peace even when nothing material changes. The Orphan cannot be reunited with Kos. The villagers cannot be brought back to life. The cord cannot be returned. But the secret has been revealed, the truth has been witnessed, and that alone is enough to quiet the worst of the rage. For players experiencing this story, the Orphan represents a different kind of challenge than most video game bosses. The difficulty of the fight is significant, yes. The Orphan is mechanically challenging, requiring skill and patience and repeated attempts to overcome. But the emotional challenge is perhaps even greater. The game asks you to kill a child, to strike down a being that has already been victimized beyond measure, to become another source of violence in a story already saturated with violence. The only justification offered is that defeating the Orphan releases it from its suffering, that the cycle must be broken even if breaking it requires more violence. But that justification is thin, and the game knows it. The Orphan's design, its crying before the fight, its screams during combat, all serve to remind players that what they're doing is not heroic. It's just necessary. Or maybe not even necessary, just the only option the game provides. This ambiguity is central to Bloodborne's vision. The game rarely offers clear moral choices or unambiguously good outcomes. Instead, it presents situations where every option is flawed, where doing nothing might be worse than doing something terrible, where the best you can hope for is minimizing harm rather than eliminating it. The Orphan embodies this philosophy perfectly. You can fight it, adding more violence to an already violent story, or you can walk away, leaving the nightmare, to continue, the Orphan to suffer eternally, the curse unaddressed. Most players choose to fight, not because it's clearly the right thing to do, but because it's what the game structure encourages, and because leaving a boss undefeated feels like leaving a story unfinished. But that choice should be uncomfortable. It should feel at least a little wrong. If it doesn't, if players can fight the Orphan with the same mindless enthusiasm they bring to any other boss, then they've missed something essential about what the encounter is trying to communicate. The Orphan of Kos is terrifying not because of its power or its grotesque appearance, but because of what it represents. It's the cost of curiosity unchecked by empathy. It's the consequence of treating living beings as objects to be studied. It's the grief that results when the bonds of family and care are violated for the sake of knowledge. It's the rage of the powerless made manifest, given teeth and claws and the ability to inflict suffering on those who have power. And it's a reminder that some things, once done, cannot be undone. The scholars who went to the fishing hamlet thought they were conducting research that would benefit all of humanity. They thought the cost was worth it, that a few dozen villagers were acceptable sacrifices for knowledge that could transform the world. They were wrong, and their wrongness created suffering that would echo through time, claiming thousands of victims, creating nightmares that would never truly end. In our world, we don't have cosmic curses or great ones to enforce justice when terrible crimes are committed in the name of progress. But we do have history, the record of what happens when empathy is abandoned for the sake of advancement. We have the consequences of colonialism, of medical experimentation without consent, of research conducted on vulnerable populations who couldn't refuse, of knowledge gained through methods that should never have been used. The Orphan of Kos asks us to sit with that history, to feel the weight of it, to understand that some costs are too high no matter what benefits might be gained. It asks us to empathise with those who are victimised in the name of progress, and to question whether we're making similar choices in our own pursuit of knowledge and advancement. This is heavy stuff for a video game boss, but Bloodborne has never shied away from heavy themes. The entire game is an exploration of the costs of ambition, the dangers of seeking knowledge without wisdom, the ways that good intentions can lead to catastrophic outcomes. The Orphan simply represents the culmination of these themes, the moment where all the game's ideas about violence, knowledge, motherhood and consequences come together in a single encounter. If you've stuck with this story all the way to the end, thank you. Thank you for sitting with me through this dark tale, for exploring the tragedy of the orphan and the fishing hamlet, for wrestling with the uncomfortable questions that this story raises. If you found value in this deep dive into Bloodborne's lore, if it's helped you fall asleep or think differently about the game, or just provided some companionship during a quiet night, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell from Bloodborne and other games, so many more dark corners to explore together. The Orphan of Kos is one of gaming's most tragic figures. A child denied life, denied peace, denied even the dignity of simple death. A victim transformed into a perpetrator, forced to inflict pain as a response to pain inflicted upon it. A focal point for cosmic revenge that spans generations, claiming hunters who had nothing to do with the original crime but were caught in the same cycle of violence. And maybe, just maybe, when we defeat the Orphan and hear the storm finally calm, we can imagine that somewhere in the depths of nightmare and curse and suffering, a child finally gets to rest, not reunited with its mother, not restored to life, not given back what was stolen, just rest. The rage quieted, the screaming stopped, the suffering, if not ended, at least paused. It's not much, it's not enough, but in the dark world of Bloodborne, it's all the mercy anyone can hope for. Thanks for listening, rest well, and may you find your worth in the waking world.